Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Just Work podcast. I am Kim Scott, Wesley Faulkner's co-host and author of the book, Just Work.
And I'm Kim Scott's co-host, Wesley Faulkner, developer advocate and all-around nice guy. Joining us today is our guest, Jessica Nordell. Jessica, can you please introduce yourself?
I am Jessica Nordell. I'm a journalist, a science writer, speaker, and the author of a book called The End of Bias, A Beginning, which looks at what has been shown to actually change people's behavior, to behave in less biased and discriminatory ways and ways that are more fair, just, and humane.
I love that. And I'm going to depart from our scheduled program and ask for some radical candor, Jessica, from you, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Since you're an expert on ending bias, I want to share with you some advice that I give to leaders in the book, Just Work. One of the things that I recommend they do is to roll out a bias disruptor program. And the idea is that they should take 3 steps with their teams. The first step is to sit down and come up with a shared vocabulary. What's the word or phrase that people will use to disrupt bias in the moment? So I like a purple flag, but other teams have thrown up a peace sign or said yo or said ouch. Whatever it is, the point is your team needs to figure out what they're going to say when they don't know what to say, because it's hard to disrupt bias. So that's number one, is an aid for the people who want to disrupt bias, whether they're the upstander or the person harmed by the bias. The second thing is to help the people who are biased. Compassion for everyone in this, because I don't know about you, but when someone says to me that I've said or done something biased, I feel ashamed. And I rarely respond at my best when I feel ashamed. So a script can be a useful way out of that. So something along the lines of, thank you for pointing it out. I get it. I'm going to work on not doing it again. Or thank you for pointing it out. I don't get it. And that second part is really hard to say, because like now I'm doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I've harmed someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't know what I did wrong. And we want to help people get through those moments, because those are tough moments. We want everyone to feel included, invited in. Bias is a pattern, and we can change the pattern if we work together. And then the third part is a shared commitment to disrupting bias in every meeting. So let's do this. Let's promise ourselves, you don't have to wave a purple flag, but bias, let's just say bias if we notice it. Because I promise you, before this is over, I'm going to say something biased, unfortunately. And so we want to make sure that we're disrupting that pattern and that we're committed to doing it. Because if nobody says anything, what it usually means is not that there was no bias in the meeting, but that people didn't feel comfortable or they didn't notice. So lay it on me. What do you think?
I think they're really interesting hypotheses. I'm especially intrigued by the idea of waving a purple flag, because it can be really hard to know what to say in the moment, in real time. And so having kind of like a nonverbal way to express that you feel like something isn't right, I think is really valuable. So my background is in science, as a science writer, and long ago I did physics, and am always interested in kind of what the data says. So my kind of angle on these bias interventions is to always ask, what measurably changes people's behavior, or what measurably creates the goals that we're looking for, whether it's a culture that feels better for people, or fewer experiences of discrimination, or people feeling more included, whatever the goal is. The question is this intervention actually getting us toward our goal in a measurable way? So what I would be curious about is to test out these interventions that you're describing, and then do some measurements, see what happens if you do a randomized trial. What is the impact of this? And I would want to look at the impact on people from marginalized groups, and whether they feel after a period of time after a period of time that this intervention has been taking place, do they feel that the environment has improved? Do they feel like there's less discrimination, or do they feel like it's easier to talk about? Is it less sort of stigmatized to bring up
Yeah.
these sort of issues? I would want to look and see if the people who are being called out or called in, however you want to say it, whether they feel like this is an opportunity to learn and grow and change, or conversely, do they feel more alienated and defensive? And I would want to look and see kind of generally, what the climate is like, how people feel at this company or this organization. Do they feel like there are, improved opportunities for all people to participate and to have their ideas acted upon? And do people feel like they're included in a meaningful way, not in a like, you got a birthday card for your birthday way, but like, are you actually given opportunities to have real influence? Those are the things I'd want to look at to test whether your approach works.
I love that. I'm gonna ask a question, and no is always a fine answer from a friend. But I am not a scientist. I studied Russian literature, Slavic literature and languages. So I would love to work with you on a project. Let's prove it or disprove it. I'm equally happy to have my hypothesis disproven as proven.
It's more
What do you think?
information, right? It's useful information.
Yeah,
If you're
it's
wrong, that's
always
useful.
good to know if you're wrong. I mean, better to know than not to know. So at some point, if you have time, there's a client that we have that would be a great client to run a test on. If you have any interest in helping me design the test, that would be incredible.
That would be really interesting. And I think my radically candid response is, may I think about it?
Yes.
And because I would love to do it, and I love new collaborators, and I love like exciting new unusual projects. So the question is just whether I have time, honestly. But yeah, let's talk about what that might look like, because it would be fun to work together. And the reason that I wrote this book was that I really wanted to know like what changes behavior, and there's not as much data out there as we would like, because a lot of interventions are never tested. So it would be a cool opportunity to actually get some more information about what works.
Amazing. All right, Wesley, thank you for making this valuable introduction.
I was going to say that also, the testing really does matter, because even if it seems like it's really good, like I heard studies about ban the box, where you can say whether or not you're previously incarcerated or not. And if you remove that box, actually, it really hurts minorities as a reflection of saying,
Oh,
I don't want to take a chance of someone being incarcerated. So if their name sounds anything ethnic, or I'll just going to say that, maybe purple flag that, then I am not going to even approve this resume to get someone in the system that could be someone who could have been in the system. And so that is one thing where it seems like, oh, this will give people more opportunities. But in fact, when you tested it, it actually removed opportunities.
wow.
That is such a good example. I love that example. And it's absolutely like a perfect example of unintended consequences, well-meaning effort that then had this completely opposite effect. Another example that I think of is the way the mental health system has really tried to move toward a more sort of biophysiological explanation for mental health distress. And so conditions that we call like bipolar or schizophrenia are described increasingly in like very biological terms. Doctors say things like, this is like diabetes, it's a condition that has to be managed just like diabetes. But what the research shows is actually the more we describe things like those sorts of mental health conditions as biological, actually people feel there's more stigma attached to those conditions. It was thought that this would decrease stigma, but in fact, it increases stigma. So just to underscore what Wesley said about unintended consequences and the importance of testing these things out.
Yeah, because the last thing, above all, do no harm. That's the that's the first goal. Love it. Okay, Wesley, should we do the reading quickly?
Yes, let's get into it really quickly.
Okay. So what I'd love to do is just read really the first page of the introduction, very first page of the rewritten book, Jessica. And Wesley and Jessica, you can both like react to it. And then I want to jump into your story, Jessica. Sound good?
Great.
All right. When you write a book about feedback, you're bound to get a lot of it. In 2017, I published a book called Radical Candor, which made the case for open, direct feedback, but only when paired with real compassion for the other person and a commitment to help them improve. Hands down, the best feedback I got on the book came from Michelle, who'd been a colleague for the better part of a decade. I liked and respected Michelle enormously and was thrilled when she invited me to give a talk about Radical Candor to the tech startup where she was CEO. When I finished giving the presentation, Michelle pulled me aside and said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture we need to succeed. But I got to tell you, as soon as I give anyone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, I get accused of being an angry Black woman. Now, I'd been in innumerable meetings with Michelle. I'd never once heard her raise her voice or even seem annoyed, let alone angry. She's objectively one of the most even-keeled, cheerful people I've ever met. Calling her angry and following that up with Black and woman was no small hint that something other than an objective assessment was going on with with the people who called her that. Michelle's experience helped me realize that I'd not written or talked much about how often feedback is tainted by bias, prejudice, and bullying. But it wasn't clear what was driving them to make such unfair accusations or why. Thoughts, reactions?
Oh yeah, I mean that story made me think about some of my workplace experiences that really gave me a lot of fire to write this book. One of the reasons that I got really interested in this subject was because I was living out these sorts of experiences. Like I remember, I'll just tell you a personal anecdote. This was many years ago, but while I was sort of building up my career as a writer, I also worked in corporate settings. So I worked for branding consultancies and creative agencies doing work on kind of business innovation. And I remember when one setting, I had a colleague who was kind of a outspoken, kind of saucy guy who always said what he meant, and everyone loved him. He was just like a star of the company. And I kind of thought, okay, well, that gives me permission to also be really outspoken and share what I think with people.
Yeah.
So I started to, be myself, share candidly what I thought about projects, express my honest opinions in meetings. And I got pulled aside and told that I was being abrasive and too aggressive, and I needed to tone it down because I was making people feel uncomfortable. And I remember thinking, like, what are you talking about? This other guy is like way more out there than I am. And so I remember having a meeting with my boss about this because he was giving me this performance feedback that I was too much. And I said, could you explain to me the difference between my behavior and the behavior of this male colleague? And my boss was silent. He just looked at me, and I could see sort of the gears turning, like it was sort of dawning on him that I was getting completely different feedback for similar behavior.
Was that silence awkward
go ahead,
for
Wesley.
you? I was like, was that silence more awkward for you or for them?
That's a good question. I remember being kind of, worked up, and it was all I could do to ask the question in a calm way because I was angry that I was being treated
How did
this
you
way.
how did you think of asking that? That was the perfect question. Like, where did that come to you from?
Well, I'd been sort of stewing about this for a while because I'd been getting, this feedback, and I thought, I don't know how to respond. I don't know what to say. And so I think, I'd sort of found that awkward situations can often be addressed with questions, or difficult, having
Yeah.
difficulty with someone can often be addressed as a question. So I think that's why it occurred to me to ask that question.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what happened next? Did did your boss acknowledge that this was unjust?
You know, I wish I could report that there was like some wonderful, you know, shining insight and everything changed. Um, he later acknowledged, you know, that maybe there was something going on. Uh, but I wouldn't say that anything dramatically changed. I
Yeah.
mean, the other thing that your story reminded me of, though, was a similar experience I had, just sort of highlighting how different people are, you know, responded to in different ways. I was at a company where there was a lot of like group team projects, and what I found was that my ideas would often get attributed to somebody else, usually a guy.
Yeah. Yes.
Common
The heat,
pattern. I mean, all
the
these
heap
things are very
eating.
common patterns. What did you say?
Heap eating.
Heap eating, right. So my work would get attributed to somebody else, and the higher ups would then think, oh, this guy came up with this idea that we then used for this client, that the client loved. And so I thought, okay, well, the solution to this, I was so naive. I thought the solution is to be very vocal about which contributions are mine. So I started saying, you know, I just want you to know that this was my idea and this was my idea. Well, then I started getting feedback that I wasn't being a team player.
Ah. It's like turtles, you know, it's bias on top of bias on
Right.
top
So
of
there was
bias.
like no way. Like my choice was either, okay, let my ideas be attributed to somebody else, not get any credit, you know, not get all the things that go with getting credit, or, you know, be chastised for being too, you know, self-promoting.
Yeah. Yeah. So frustrating. So Wesley, Jessica and I are white women. You're a black man. How does this play out for you? I mean, I imagine that these biases play out differently for different people depending on identity. How does this play out for you?
Eerily similar. It's the same thing. That's like I feel like one of those movies like Groundhog's Day, where you're like,
Yeah.
all right, well, I'll try something different, and then the outcome seems to always seems to always turn out the same way. It's really really hard, and I think that the if there's not someone looking for the flaw in the system that's in the position of power, then the outlier or the person at fault is the person that they identified. And so they will not look at the system, but just look at the individual. And so I feel that when you are a person of color or someone who is marginalized in a specific area, you're the thing that's the odd one out of the whole thing. And so if the cohesion's not there, if
Mm-hmm.
things feel like off, then it's easier to point to the thing that sticks out like a sore thumb. And yeah, and that's usually me. And I think I found a formula now where if you mature enough in both your industry and being able to not internalize it, which is a big big thing
Yeah.
that's easily said rather than done,
Yeah.
it makes it easier to survive. And when I say survive, I meant mentally, but also survive having a job with these conflicts or being able to navigate these difficulties.
So Jessica, one of the best things I read on that, we'll talk about the abrasive thing in a second, but on the problem of other people claiming credit for your ideas and your work, or another version is, oh, you know, you did that, so it must not have been that hard, you know,
Or
and
you did that, so you got lucky. You
yeah,
succeeded at
yeah,
that, so you must
yeah,
be really lucky, not like
yeah.
insanely hardworking and
Yeah.
skilled. Right.
Yes, exactly. So there was a Twitter thread by an engineering director at Google. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Mecca Orakeki.
Oh yeah, I know
And
Mecca. Hmm.
yeah, 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 yeah. And so, have you read his thread on the difficulty anchor?
I don't think so.
So what he said is that if he said, "Yo, or maybe he didn't say yo. These are my words, not his." But he said to underrepresented folks out there, no matter in what way you're underrepresented. Mecca is a black man. He said, if you find that your work is getting dismissed as trivial, or that other people are claiming credit for your work, the solution is to find a difficulty anchor. look around your company and find someone who is very well respected and known as being tough, kind of a hard ass. And ask that when you're before you embark on a project, ask that person to help you, to be sort of a mentor for you on the project. And then and explain to them a couple of times the problem that you're trying to solve. And then when people say it's easy, if your difficulty anchor is in the room, that person will say, "Oh no, that was not easy. That was hard." And then they're gonna sort of uh, lend some of their credibility to you. I thought it was such practical, good advice. I really
It's really
love that.
practical. And at the same time, I feel like my whole the reason that I wrote this book was that I don't want people to have to do that. Like
Yes,
one
yeah,
of
no, Mecca
the
says that too.
right, so constantly putting the burden on people who are already
Yes,
burdened. Like, not only are you experiencing these unfair, moments at work, but now it's your responsibility to figure out how to fix them. I mean, I remember talking to one of the people I interviewed for my book is a mid-career engineer in aerospace.
mm-hmm.
And she is an African American woman who has been the only African American woman in all of the work settings that she's
Yeah,
been in. And she told me that she spends about half of her work hours figuring out how to do things like get correct credit for her work, make sure she's invited to meetings
yeah,
that she needs to be. I
a
mean,
huge tax.
it's basically an additional part-time job. And that makes me crazy. It's like
Yes,
so unfair. So I appreciate I appreciate these, ingenious workarounds like what Mecca described, but I also would like to live in a world where that wasn't necessary.
yes, and that was how Mecca started his thread, which is this shouldn't be necessary, but if you don't, so I think we should give some advice for bosses as to how to make sure this kind of stuff is not happening. Because like you, I had a boss. By the way, a second ago I waved the purple flag. So some feedback I got also on Twitter is that I tend to use the word crazy when what I really mean is it frustrates me, or and I think just in the spirit of being aware of mental health issues, like using that metaphor
Did I say crazy? I don't think I
yes,
even
you
noticed it.
did.
Oh, thank you for well, I appreciate you pointing it
That's
out.
why
I didn't even So that is an example of unexamined bias, right? I didn't even notice that I was saying it. So thank you for mentioning
I
it.
actually noticed that I used that word earlier in our conversation before we started recording, and I thought I should have waved the purple flag on myself, but I didn't.
I have
Even the proponent.
a purple
That's good.
marker here.
Purple marker is perfect. I'm sure I will. Even though I got that feedback years ago, I still use the words. I like, and that's part of this. We need to be patient, but also persistent with ourselves. Like changing these habits of language is going to take some time. It's not going to happen
Yeah,
overnight.
agreed. Yes.
Very much.
So but before I disrupted the bias, you were saying that it's unfair that people should have to spend this much time figuring out how to navigate around, and I totally agree. So
Yeah,
one
I
of
mean, it's sort of. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I remember, like one of the pieces of advice in the book Lean In was that, like, in order to not be seen as too assertive, women should wear kind of soft sweaters, sort of like soft fabrics. And I was like, who can keep track of
Was
this?
that really? Oh my gosh! I can't believe that was in the. I helped edit. I would have, if I had noticed that, I would have struck it.
Here's
That
how you
is
could be more palatable to the fragile egos in the room.
Right, right. But at the same time, like, I appreciate what she was trying to do with that book, which is like give people tools like Mecca, giving people tools that they
yeah.
can use, because we don't live in, this is the world that we live in. So how do you deal with the fact that you're in a job right now with specific limitations? I mean, it's a real
Yes.
challenge. So I don't want to
Yes.
dismiss
Yeah.
that either.
Yeah, no, and it's so interesting. It's sort of like in Just Work, I write for people harmed, people who cause harm, for upstanders, people who observe this stuff happening, and for leaders. And it feels almost like a whack-a-mole problem, because as soon as I'm talking about what leaders should do, people are like, "Well, that's useless because my leader is useless." And I'm like, "Okay, we'll go to the chapter on person harmed." Well, but I shouldn't have to do that, because I'm like, yes, but like we have to start somewhere, right? It's hard.
Totally. Yeah.
All right, Wesley, you are on a podcast with two loud women. I want to make sure that we're that we're not talking over you. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, it's I agree that there needs to be two ways of being able to deal with the situation that you have, rather than wish you were in a situation that was fair. And um, when I try to tell people this, I make sure that I really front load it, saying this is not your responsibility, this is not
Mm-hmm.
something you need to do, but this is a way that you can at least have a framework of dealing with some of this stuff, which is
Mm-hmm.
important to understand. Of this is how you can make sense of it, so you can navigate it. One thing that is really doubly harmful, especially with the aerospace engineer example, is that in the realm of mental or knowledge work, where that's kind of why you're there, is to have the thoughts, have the thinking, and put things together, that mental tax or that mental fatigue that comes along with that really degrades your work, which also starts a spiral with underperforming and then reinforcing negative stereotypes that then later causes you to underperform and to possibly lose your job. And so that is one of the things that I try to arrest. But burnout happens all the time, but especially when you are in a place of high pressure, and you're relying on your mental acuity to kind of get yourself through. But then at the same time, the environment that you're put in is putting this grading manner. So I basically, what I'm saying is I agree with everything you said, and I'm stealing your idea and taking credit for it.
So I want to get a thought from both of you about something leaders can do about the abrasive problem, because this in particular resonates for me, because I've been accused of that, uh, and and by managers, like in the guise of feedback, and it was like, anyway, I was told, "Are you aware of the competence likability bias?" And I wasn't. They explained it to me, this manager. And then I thought that the aha was, so I should fix the bias in the other people. And instead my boss said to me, "So try to be more likable." I'm like, "You missed the whole point." And this is not a stupid man. He was quite brilliant, actually, but had some areas of unawareness, shall we say. And so, one of the things that is helpful that leaders can do is to use Textio for performance feedback. And Textio will flag words like that, like abrasive, and get prompt people to think. Would you be saying of a white man, like if my husband behaved the same way that Michelle did in that story, he'd be called a very reasonable,
Oh
great guy.
yeah, a real go-getter, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I, as a white woman, I might be called a badass, but which would have some negative connotation and some positive connotation, but for Michelle, it was all, people were all negative about it. And so beginning to point this out to people, in the work where they're, when they are doing the thing, either when they're in the meeting and wave the purple flag, or in the performance review, like have the word turn purple. Actually, it turns red in Textio, which is great. I mean, it's very effective. I don't know. What do you think about that intervention, that on the part
I,
of leaders?
Jessica, I think you mentioned it in chapter 9 of your book, actually.
Yeah, I love Kieran Snyder's work, who created Textio, and I love her. She did that great a study of performance evaluations
Yes,
where
that
she found,
article was
oh, it was
so
amazing. Where she found that, like, women in their performance feedback, I don't remember the exact numbers, but are given feedback on their personalities like 70% of the time, and men are like barely given feedback
yeah,
about their personalities, which is
yeah.
amazing. I mean, it reminded me of also of the Ellen Pao trial, and the way Ellen
Yes.
Pao was described as being really abrasive and aggressive, but also shy and too retiring. I mean, it was like people
Which
couldn't
is it?
figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think that's super valuable. Yeah, giving, doing sort of a real analysis of the language to see what words are being used to describe people from different backgrounds.
And
I
I
I
think
love it.
on that note, that was a great way to end the show. I would like to say thank you so much, Jessica, for being on the podcast. It's great having you here. Could you tell us a little bit more about where people can find out more about you and your book?
Absolutely. So my book is available anywhere you like to buy books, indie bookstores, online. You can find me on Substack. I have a Substack newsletter that's interviews with fascinating people that I publish about once a month. It's called Who We Are to Each Other. And I talk about how we can all become more human, trustworthy, and free. And you can find me on my website, which is jessicanordell.com.
Love it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
So,
me.
thank you. So if you enjoyed this and you, listener, have a story that you would like to share with us, we would love to hear your story. And if you want to be on the podcast, we'd invite you to be on the podcast. Send us a note, hello@justworktogether.com, and let us know your stories. I think one of the things I really admire about Wesley is his ability to build community and solidarity. And I think that is how we're going to solve these problems, no matter what role we play.
And thank you, Kim, and thank you for the compliment. And what I like about you is that you are a person that tells it like it is. And it's really great to have radical feedback. And we would like your radical feedback as well. So if you would like to rate us on Apple Podcasts, that'd be great to let us know how we're doing.
You can also send us feedback at hello@justworktogether.com. All right. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you next time.
Take care.